If I told you that before the war with Iran even begins, America has already set aside $47 trillion, and the account of this money will not be settled in the next 100 years. Because this money is not in any budget, it is not written in any ledger, officially this money does not even exist. Then where did it go? Some people say the war with Iran will never happen. I thought the same thing, until I found this $47 trillion file. Now before you say this is just another conspiracy theory, let me stop you right there. Because what I am about to show you is not theory. It is not speculation. It is not something I made up in a basement at 2 in the morning. Every single piece of evidence I am going to walk you through today comes from government documents, official inspector general reports, congressional testimonies, and mainstream economic research. The only difference between what you are about to hear and what you see on your nightly news is that nobody on your nightly news is connecting these dots for you. And after today, you will understand exactly why. Let us start at the beginning, not at Iran, not at the Federal Reserve. Let us start with a pattern. Because once you see the pattern, everything else falls into place. Let us go back to September 10th, 2001, one single day before the attacks that changed the world. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld stood in front of reporters at the Pentagon and made an announcement that should have dominated headlines for weeks. He said, and I want you to hear this clearly, that the Department of Defense could not account for $2.3 trillion in transactions. $2.3 trillion. Gone. Unaccounted for. Missing from the ledgers of the most powerful military institution on the planet. He said it himself. It is on video. You can look it up right now. September 10th, 2001. And then the very next morning, the September 11th attacks happened, and that story disappeared forever. Nobody followed up. Nobody demanded answers. The investigation simply stopped. Think about that timing for a moment. Just sit with it. Then comes Afghanistan. October 2001. American forces enter the country and begin what would become a 20-year occupation. Over those 2 decades, the United States spent over $2.3 trillion on the Afghanistan war alone. A special inspector general called SIGAR was eventually appointed to track reconstruction spending. What did SIGAR find? Billions of dollars in contracts that could not be verified. Infrastructure projects that did not exist. Money paid to ghost soldiers in the Afghan army who were never real people. One estimate suggested that up to $19 billion was lost to waste, fraud, and abuse in Afghanistan reconstruction alone. Not military spending, just reconstruction. Just the money meant to build schools and hospitals and roads. Gone. Then comes Iraq, March 2003. Before the invasion, the United States was already moving money, massive amounts of cash. We are not talking about electronic transfers. We are talking about physical American $100 bills, shrink-wrapped into bricks, stacked on wooden pallets, and loaded onto cargo planes headed for Baghdad. The Federal Reserve actually airlifted cash into Iraq. By some accounts, the total amount of physical cash shipped into Iraq in the early months of the occupation was close to $12 billion. $12 billion in cash, flown into a war zone, with no serious tracking system in place. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction later reported that $8.8 billion of those funds simply could not be accounted for. $8.8 billion. Vanished. The investigation produced some reports, some recommendations, and then quietly faded away. Then comes Libya, 2011. Muammar Gaddafi had been the leader of Libya for over 4 decades. He was brutal. He was authoritarian. He supported terrorism in his earlier years. All of that is true. But by 2011, something else was also true. Gaddafi had a plan. He had been working for years on introducing a gold-backed African currency. that he called the gold dinar. The idea was simple, and from the perspective of the global financial system, extremely dangerous. African and Middle Eastern nations would sell their oil not in US dollars, but in this new gold-backed currency. Countries that adopted the gold dinar would no longer need American dollars to participate in the global oil market. And if you no longer need American dollars, the entire foundation of American economic dominance begins to shake. 3 days before Gaddafi was captured and killed, the IMF quietly froze a transaction related to Libyan state funds. The details remain classified. NATO jets appeared in Libyan airspace. And the gold dinar project died with Gaddafi in a drainage ditch in Sirte. Iraq under Saddam Hussein had also announced plans to sell oil in euros instead of dollars before the invasion. Saddam Hussein is dead. The euro oil plan died with him. Are you seeing the pattern yet? Every country that has faced American military intervention in the past 25 years had either moved away from the petrodollar system or was openly planning to. And in every single case, before the military action began, there were significant financial anomalies, unaccounted government funds, missing ledger entries, classified transactions that have never been explained to the public. Now let us talk about the petrodollar system properly, because this is the engine that runs everything I am describing. In the early 1970s, President Nixon ended the direct convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Before this moment, every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by a specific amount of gold held in American vaults. After Nixon ended this, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency. Its value was backed not by gold but by trust and by demand. The question then became, how do you ensure global demand for a currency that is no longer backed by anything physical? The answer came in 1974 through a secret agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The details of this agreement were classified for decades and only became fully public through later document releases. The arrangement was this: Saudi Arabia would agree to sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection to the Saudi royal family and guarantee their security. Other OPEC nations were brought into the same arrangement over the following years, and just like that, the petrodollar system was born. The genius of this system, from America's perspective, is breathtaking. Because oil is the lifeblood of the modern global economy, every country on Earth that needs oil, which is every country on Earth, must first acquire US dollars to purchase it. Japan needs dollars. Germany needs dollars. China needs dollars. India needs dollars. This creates a permanent, self-sustaining global demand for American currency. And when there is always demand for your currency, you can print more of it without immediately destroying its value. You can run massive deficits. You can fund wars. You can maintain military bases in 80 countries. Because the whole world is essentially subsidizing your spending by needing your currency. Iran has been systematically dismantling this arrangement for years. Iran has oil trading agreements with China that are settled in Chinese yuan. Iran has barter arrangements with Russia and India that bypass the dollar entirely. Iran is a founding member of discussions around creating alternative payment systems for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that would reduce dependence on SWIFT, the dollar-based international banking communication system. Iran is, in the language of the financial establishment, a systemic threat to the petrodollar order, not because of its nuclear program, not because of its support for regional militias, but because of its currency behavior. And this brings us to the number at the center of everything, the $47 trillion. Let me explain where this figure actually comes from, because I want to be precise. In 2017, A Michigan State University economist named Mark Skidmore began going through publicly available government documents. His specialty was public finance. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a mainstream academic doing what academics do, which is reading documents and following numbers. What he found in the Department of Defense and Department of Housing and Urban Development financial reports was so shocking that he initially assumed he had made an error. He went back through the documents multiple times. He brought in a team of graduate students to verify his work. The conclusion was the same every time. Between 1998 and 2015, the federal government had made unsupported accounting adjustments, which is the technical term for financial entries that have no supporting documentation, totaling over $21 trillion. $21 trillion in transactions with no paper trail, no receipts, no explanation, just numbers that appeared in government accounts with no documented origin or destination. Skidmore's research was eventually picked up by Bloomberg, by Forbes, by various mainstream financial publications. The Pentagon responded by announcing it would conduct its first-ever department-wide audit. The results of that audit were released in 2018. The Pentagon failed. It failed again in 2019. It failed in 2020, 2021, and 2022. 5 consecutive failed audits. The Pentagon's own auditors said the department's financial systems were so fragmented and so poorly documented that a clean audit opinion was not achievable in the near term. The $47 trillion figure I mentioned at the beginning comes from projections made by independent defense economists who have attempted to calculate the total fiscal exposure of a full-scale Iran conflict. This includes the direct military cost, which based on Iraq and Afghanistan precedent would be several $trillion over a decade. It includes the cost of regional spillover, because Iran has allies and proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza, and a war with Iran would likely become a regional war very quickly. It includes the cost of oil market disruption, because Iran sits on the Strait of Hormuz through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. It includes the long-term cost of veteran care, reconstruction, and debt servicing. And it includes the indirect cost of dollar inflation, as the Federal Reserve inevitably creates new money to fund the conflict. When you add all of that together, the median estimate from serious independent researchers is in the range of $40 to $50 trillion. $47 trillion is where those projections converge. And here is the critical point. None of this money will go through normal congressional appropriations. Not all of it. Because the American financial system has developed a complex architecture of off-budget spending mechanisms that allow for massive financial commitments that never face full public scrutiny. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is controlled directly by the Treasury Secretary without congressional approval, has been used to conduct major financial operations whose full details have never been disclosed. Special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund can be used to fund operations in ways that do not appear in standard budget documents. Black budget allocations, the portions of the defense budget that are classified and presented to Congress in a redacted form, have grown substantially in the past 2 decades. And the Federal Reserve's own balance sheet operations, its decisions about what assets to purchase and what credit to extend, are not subject to the same oversight as regular government spending. This is the architecture of financial invisibility, and it is completely legal. It was built legally, piece by piece over decades, precisely so that large financial commitments could be made without triggering the kind of public debate that might slow them down. Now I want to step back from the trap I have been setting for the past several minutes because I believe you deserve the full picture. Not just the alarming version, the complete, honest version. Here is what is documented fact. The Pentagon has failed 5 consecutive audits. The unaccounted transactions in U.S. government accounts run into the tens of trillions. The petrodollar system is real, was established through a real agreement, and does genuinely create financial incentives for the United States to resist countries that move away from dollar-based oil trade. Defense contractors do genuinely profit enormously from military conflicts. The revolving door between the defense industry and Washington policymaking is well documented and ongoing. Iran is genuinely moving away from dollar-based trade. All of that is real. Here is what is more complicated. The $47 trillion figure, while grounded in real estimates, is a projection, not a confirmed budget item. The specific claim that this money has been set aside in advance is a framework for understanding future fiscal exposure, not a literal bank account somewhere with Iran's name on it. The relationship between financial incentives and specific policy decisions is real but not always direct or simple. Not every unaccounted government dollar represents intentional theft or fraud. A significant portion of the accounting chaos at the Pentagon reflects genuine bureaucratic dysfunction, incompatible computer systems, and the inherent difficulty of tracking financial operations across a global military presence. And Iran itself is not a simple villain or a simple victim. The Iranian government's support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and various Iraqi militias has caused real suffering for real people. Its nuclear program creates genuine anxieties among its neighbors and American allies in the region. Its treatment of its own citizens, particularly women, particularly religious minorities, particularly political dissidents, represents a serious human rights concern that deserves to be named clearly. But and this is the crucial point, the existence of real problems in Iran does not automatically justify the financial and military response that is being built around it. Real problems can be used as cover for decisions that are primarily driven by financial interest. This has happened before. We watched it happen with Iraq. The weapons of mass destruction turned out not to exist. The Al-Qaeda connection turned out to be fabricated. But the financial interests in that war, the oil, the reconstruction contracts, the military spending, those were very real. So what do you do with all of this? What does it mean for you sitting here watching a video on the internet? It means you should follow the money, before the rhetoric, before the news coverage, before the official statements about threats and security and democracy. Ask who profits. Ask where the money is moving. Ask why a government that cannot pass its own financial audit is nonetheless able to commit to trillion-dollar military adventures without a serious public conversation about cost. It means you should demand accountability from the institutions that claim to serve you. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency fully accountable to elected officials. The Pentagon's finances are not fully transparent to the taxpayers who fund them. The decisions that will determine whether your children's generation inherits a stable world or a world defined by endless conflict and unsustainable debt are being made in rooms you will never enter, by people you will never vote for. And it means you should be deeply skeptical of the next time a foreign country is presented to you as an existential threat that must be dealt with militarily. Not because there are no genuine threats in the world, there are, but because the presentation of threats has historically been manipulated by people with financial stakes in the response to those threats. This is not a left-wing or right-wing observation. It is a structural one. The incentives are built into the system itself. The $47 trillion question is not really about Iran at all. It is about what kind of financial and political system you are willing to accept. One where accountability is optional, where the books are never fully open, where wars are funded through mechanisms deliberately designed to avoid public scrutiny, and where the people who profit from conflict are the same people who have the loudest voice in deciding whether conflict happens. Or something different, something where the ledgers are open, where the audits pass, where the money can be followed, where the decision to commit a generation of national wealth to a military conflict requires the same kind of transparent public debate that should accompany any decision of that magnitude. The ledgers are missing, the audits have failed. The pattern across Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya has repeated itself with eerie consistency. And now the financial architecture around Iran is being quietly assembled in the same way it was assembled before each of those conflicts. Watch where the money moves, not where the missiles point. The missiles point where the money has already decided they should point. And that, more than any news broadcast, any political speech, any dramatic satellite image presented at a United Nations podium, is the real story of what is building around Iran right now. The question is not whether you believe all of this. Some of it you should question. Some of it deserves more research and more skepticism than a single video can provide. The question is whether you are willing to start asking the questions that the people managing this system would very much prefer you not to ask. Because the $47 trillion does not care whether you believe in it or not. It is moving, right now, through accounts that will never be audited, toward purposes that will never be fully explained. And when the bill comes due, as it always does, it will be handed to people who had no seat at the table when the decision was made. That is the file. That is what it says. Now you have seen it too. Let me leave you with one final thought that I want you to carry with you long after this video ends. Every single empire in human history that has overextended itself militarily has followed the same financial arc. It starts with genuine strength, real economic power, real military capability, real global influence. Then comes the overreach, wars in too many places, commitments that stretch beyond what the underlying economy can sustain, and then comes the inflation, the currency debasement, the slow erosion of purchasing power for ordinary citizens while the connected elite find ways to protect their wealth. Rome did this. The British Empire did this. The Spanish Empire did this before them. The United States is not immune to this pattern simply because it is the United States. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency has given America an extraordinary buffer, a longer runway than any previous empire enjoyed. But buffers are not infinite. Runways end. And the question of whether America burns through that buffer in a series of financially opaque military adventures or chooses a different path is genuinely one of the most important questions of our time. Iran matters not because of what the Iranian government is or is not. It matters because of what the response to Iran reveals about the financial and political structures that actually govern the world's most powerful country. When a government cannot account for $21 trillion of its own transactions, and yet can project absolute confidence about trillion-dollar military commitments, something fundamental has broken in the relationship between institutions and accountability. You have a right to know where your money goes, not because you can stop every decision, not because transparency alone solves every problem, but because an informed public is the only real check on systems that would prefer to operate in the dark. The $47 trillion file does not have a single author. It does not have a single villain. It is the accumulated result of thousands of decisions made over decades by people operating within a system that rewards opacity and punishes accountability. Understanding it does not require believing every claim made by every person on the internet who has found a dark pattern in a government document. It requires something simpler and harder at the same time. It requires the willingness to look at official documents with clear eyes, to follow numbers where they lead even when the destination is uncomfortable, and to ask out loud the questions that powerful people would prefer remained unasked. That is all this video has tried to do. Follow the pattern, name the numbers, show you the file, the rest is up to you. If this video made you think, if it raised questions you had not considered before, share it with someone who deserves to ask those questions too. Not because I have given you all the answers. I have not. Nobody has all the answers when the ledgers are deliberately kept incomplete. But the conversation itself, the act of asking, the refusal to accept that these things are simply too complicated for ordinary people to understand, that is where accountability begins. The people who built this system of financial invisibility are counting on your silence and your confusion. The most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to provide either one.